Hey, good evening, friends. Tonight is the last and final class in this series, Summer Perkei Avot. We go slowly but surely, like I shared with you. It's really a opportunity to go into the Perkei Avot and to allow ourselves to discuss them and to allow the teachings of Perkei Avot, not just to that we should kind of read through them, but they should really penetrate within us. There's a great story of a fellow. He comes to the rabbi and he says, "Rabbi," he says, "I've completed my 1,000th page of Talmud." And the rabbi looks at the man and looks him up and down and he says, "And?" He says, "And what did the Talmud teach you?" Sometimes we can learn and learn and learn, but it's not just how much we read, but it's also about how much we actually learn, how much we're taught, how much it penetrates. Something that we spoke about last week, the idea of the 100 times of review and the 101st review, that extra review. The So here we are, Mishnah 10, chapter 3. We began this Mishnah last week. We'll pick up on it again. This is the teachings of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, as we said last week, was the great scholar who was a very pious individual, the one who told his daughter, he said that he who told olive to burn can instruct that the vinegar should burn, and you don't have to, we just have to do our part, and Hashem is going to help us. And a man who was greatly God-fearing, who doesn't just teach about the importance of being God-fearing, but also who really lives it. And that was this first teaching that we learned last week in Mishnah 9, was that in order to properly study Torah, in order to properly be a receptacle of Torah, to capture Torah, one has to fear sin. If that's what he said, one whose fear of sin takes precedence to his wisdom endures. In other words, if the first thing is a person is God-fearing and a person wants to do what Hashem wants, and he's trying to study and he's trying to understand what Hashem wants and how Hashem wants and so on, so such a person, Hashem will, he will be guided with that will and the desire to follow the will of Hashem. He will have an enduring wisdom. Somebody who's just doesn't have a foundation and they just try to pursue wisdom for the sake of or think that wisdom itself will be the answer, they can go very, very far away from the truth, because wisdom can also be very, very misleading. It can be, if it doesn't have a foundation. In this Mishnah, Mishnah 10, he kind of closes the loop and he comes back and he says, what about after one has studied Torah? Hu Omer, he used to say, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa would say, Kol shema asav mirubi mechachmaso, chachmaso miskayamis. Anybody that their deeds are more than their wisdom endures. In other words, if a person is not just it's not just how much you learn, but it's how much does the learning translate into action. Does your learning, if it doesn't translate into action, that's not an enduring wisdom. That's not a true wisdom. True wisdom is one that transforms and turns into action. And we take action. It's a great story. There was a friend of mine whose grandfather used to tell the story that his father, this was kind of back in the day, and there was a bunch of people, and they're standing around and they're watching their friend's factory on fire. They're watching a friend's factory on fire, and they're so upset, and they say, "Oi, could you believe what's happening to Johnny? I feel so bad for Johnny. He's losing his life's work. He's losing his factory. Look at that fire." And they're all standing around feeling bad for Johnny. So he gets up there and he takes off his hat. This was back in the time when people wore hats, when and he passes around the hat and he says, "Well," he says, "I feel bad for Johnny, $10. He says, "How bad do you feel for Johnny?" It's not just about, and he passes around the hat, and we can't just be feeling bad for each other or, just living a life of thoughts and feelings. but we have to actually live a life of taking action. Now, that's what bothers me a lot of times when people say our thoughts and prayers are with them. But we're not looking for thoughts and prayers. Sometimes we are, but most of the time we're looking for action. We're looking for, what are you going to do? How can you make a difference? So, if somebody's deeds exceed his wisdom, then his wisdom can endure. That is a true wisdom. But if somebody's wisdom is even it outweighs his actions, in other words, he's wise, he knows the truth, he has great ideas, but it doesn't translate into action, then the wisdom itself will not endure. That's not an enduring wisdom. It's just a fleeting idea. They tell a story. There was a great child psychologist. He had written many books. He had a very famous podcast. He was a social influencer. And one day, in front of his office, they pour a new a parking lot. They repave a new parking lot. And he comes there in the morning, and he sees that there's a bunch of children who had taken sticks, and they were making, they were, as the concrete was still soft, they were writing their name or maybe writing some other shtick, making some pictures, as kids do, and in wet cement. And he lashes out and he loses it at them and he screams at them. He says, where are you from and who raised you and how dare you? Did you ever consider? And anyhow, the guy just completely loses it. So his wife, who had been watching all this, turns to him and says, you're considered quite the child psychology expert. He says, but in that moment, it didn't really come through. You seem to really lose it at those kids, So he turns to his wife. He says, I really love children in the abstract, not in the concrete. Not in the concrete. So, but anyhow, but the thing is that we have to also, in order for our wisdom to be in the concrete, it has to really be channeled into action. Okay, now we learned this last week. And here we're picking up. Hu hayomer, he would also say. Chanina and Das would also say, Kol sharuach habrios no chahimenu, ruach hamakom no chahimenu. Kol she'in ruach habrios no chahimenu, ein ruach hamakom no chahimenu. Anybody that the ruach habriot, anybody that others find pleasing, that other creatures, brios is creatures, God's creations, here translates as fellow men, fellow people, but really anybody that other creations of Hashem find pleasing, ruach hamakom no chemenu, then Hashem also finds you pleasing. Chol she'ein ruach habrios no chemenu, but if other people don't find you pleasing, ein ruach hamakom no chemenu, then God also doesn't find you pleasing. Now, it's an interesting Mishnah because, this is not about being a people pleaser. People pleaser is actually a very negative, it's a very negative type of behavior because there's no commitment to truth. There's no commitment to greater good or to advancing. What do people pleasers do? They wake up in the morning, they read the polls, and they say that this is my new policy because this is what the people want to hear. You don't have to tell the people what they want to hear. You have to tell the people what they need to hear. So it's not about people pleasing. What it means is if people find you affable, no chayman, if they find you comfortable, if you're able to lead, if you're able to state the truth, you're able to say your truth and lift people up, but people feel that you're doing that in a sincere way, in an authentic way, in a humble way. They don't feel that you're serving yourself. They feel that you're serving God. See, what does it mean to serve Hashem? To serve Hashem means somebody who's willing to put themselves on the side, somebody who's willing to not think about themselves, but rather their concern is about Hashem. They're thinking about what does Hashem want from me? What does Hashem want from the world? How can we lift each other up? Well, that when a person does that, and if a person puts himself on the side with humility, that's a servant of God. But it's possible that a person will be so religious, and they'll be so learned, but unfortunately, it's also possible that they are going to be considered, and they're going to really be self-centered, self-righteous, self-justified, think that they know, that they have the truth, they're living the truth, they're for some reason greater than, because they are more of a, more committed, or a greater they're greater, maybe they're even a martyr, maybe they even will give everything up for the cause. But they're actually sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes even the religiosity itself can be a sense of self, a sense, could be promoting a sense of my own experience of my and my own self-worth, my own self-dignity, my own respect. Maybe other people give them respect for that. Maybe because they're so knowledgeable. Sometimes you go into a shul, and they have a lot of respect for the rabbi. The rabbi walks in and people stand up, and that can be it can be a respect for Torah, but it could also be a challenge. It could also be intoxicating. It could be that type of respect. So the question is, what do people? So people will have a sense. They'll have a sense of whether they find you humble, whether they find you authentic. So that's what Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is saying. If other people find you authentic, if other people find you affable, if other people find you pleasant, God also finds you pleasant, because you're not in the service for yourself, you're in the service for Hashem. But if other people just feel, if they sense a sense of haughtiness, an air about you, that they feel like it's you're just about yourself, so Hashem probably doesn't enjoy that either. There's the Yiddish expression. It's a sharp expression, but it's kind of a truth. It says it says Heilig bist du, aber stinken stinkst du. It says you're very, very, you may be very holy, but you also smell really bad. And the idea is that somebody can be very, very holy, but there could be a foul odor about that, because there's something wrong. There's something too, maybe self-righteous, maybe self-justified, maybe just a sense of ego, a sense of self. So we have to ensure that we are humble as we go about it. If we are humble and other people feel us and see us and perceive us as such, then God can also it probably finds our service meaningful and humble and before God. Humility. Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas. Continuing in this Mishnah. Ben, you want to read?
Sure thing. Rabbi Dosa, the son of Hyrcanus, would say, morning sleep, noontime wine, children's talk, and sitting at the meeting places of the ignoramus drive a person from the world.
Yeah, very sharp Mishnah. Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas is telling us, he says like this: it's easy. A person can actually waste their life away. So be on the lookout. Be vigilant. Morning sleep. See, a person can sleep in their mornings, right? You can lose the morning to sleep. You can lose you can lose your noontime to to lunch. You drink wine. You get a little intoxication, and your whole day could go by. Children's talk, and in other words, to talk about just childish things instead of having deep, meaningful conversations. Similarly, sitting at the meeting places of an ignoramus, in other words, people just sit around and they just talk about things that don't really matter. We can waste our life, drive a person from the world. We can waste our life. We can let our life just run by. I saw a great meme the other day. It said 15 years ago, people would go online to escape the real world. He said, nowadays you go to the real world to escape the internet. It's a sad truth. In other words, we have to, but sometimes we can just literally, pass our time. So be very vigilant. There's also an idea of morning sleep in the morning of our lives. It's easy to, when a person is young, they can just sleep that time away. They can just kind of not be cognizant of it. When at noontime wine is in the noontime in our life, in the high noon of our life, we can become intoxicated. We can just chase pleasures. Children's talk and sitting at the meeting place of ignoramuses, in other words, we could spend the older years of our life just sitting and in talking about things that really don't matter. In the morning, noon, and evening of our lives, the opportunities present themselves to just lose sense of real deep meaning, of real deep living. I saw a talk. There was somebody who was the fellow was giving the talk. He had been in a very serious car accident, and his car was like, it kind of hit into and it was like it slid off the road and it ran into a tree, really at a very high pace. And if you've ever been in a car accident like that, you've had a similar situation, you'll know that those few seconds are very, very slow motion, as the car is rolling towards the tree, and it's just out of control, and he knows that there's nothing that he can do. It's there's a few seconds that goes past very, very quickly. Very slowly. And during those few seconds, and he's thinking that this is likely to be the last moment of his life. And the thought comes into his head, and he says, did I ever live? Did I ever live? Because sometimes a person's life can go by them, and they can ask themselves, did I ever live, or did I just kind of sleep, indulge in pleasures, and talk about things that don't matter? So easy. We can waste our whole lives with that. There's a book, famous book I've quoted a number of times in these classes. It's called I think it's called The Five Regrets of the Dying. It's written by a hospice care nurse who's engaging in meaningful conversation with these people that she was taking care of on hospice. And she started to interview them and ask them, what are the regrets as they look back in their life? What are the things that they regret? And she saw that what was the number one regret? What's the number one regret that most people had in their, as they were facing their imminent death? What was the number one regret? What would you think? Anybody want to try? Anybody want to guess?
They work too much.
So that was number two. Number two was that they didn't spend enough time with family and friends, and they were too engaged in work. That's number two. What is number one? The number one regret is that they didn't live authentically to themselves. So easy to just live a life the way others want us to live, the way that society tells us that we should live, the way that the way that whether it's fashion or style or vogue or whatever is acceptable, or how PC or whatever it is, but we can live our whole life inauthentic to ourselves. There's so many ways that life can just pass us by. So here Abdois, the son of Hyrcanus, said, be pleasant to other people, like we said, be affable, but don't let your life just be taken away by indulgence, by sleeping, by just inattentiveness or unconsciousness. Let your life be filled with your conscious decisions and your conscious choices. Strong Mishnah. They're all strong. Here we have 11. Rabbi Elazar Hamudai. Joel, you want to read 11?
Okay. Rabbi Elazar of Modi'in would say, one who profanes the Kodashim, the holy things consecrated for the service of Hashem in the holy temple, degrades the festivals, humiliates his friend in public, abrogates the covenant of our father Abraham, that is, circumcision, or who interprets the Torah contrary to its true intent, although he may possess Torah knowledge and good deeds, he has no share in the world to come.
All right. Well, this is a fascinating Mishnah because what is the common thread in this list? So Rabbi Elazar of Modi'in This Rabbi Elazar, we'll talk about him soon, but he lives after the times of the destruction of the Second Temple. He is a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. He is actually the uncle of Bar Kokhba, the famous Bar Kokhba who leads a revolt against the Romans 52 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. And he teaches as follows. Now, let's find the thread. Hamachalel takadashim, one who profanes the holy matters, that which is consecrated for temple services. He degrades the festivals. He humiliates others in public. And he abrogates the covenant of our father Abraham, the circumcision. Or he interprets Torah contrary to its true intent. So although he may possess Torah knowledge and have good deeds, he has no share in the world to come. What is the theme that runs between these 6 matters? What is he highlighting? What is he teaching over here? What is he teaching? Anybody? Have a thought? Well, what Rabbi Elazar of Modin, if we look at this list, we're going to see that he is combating a very particular notion. And that is that he's talking about the idea of holiness, of consecration, of the ability to actually transform the world and inject the world with holiness. And there are those who just don't accept, they do away with the concept of holiness. There are those who simply, they profane the holy matters. Is there something you've dedicated an animal for God's service? This is going to be a sacrifice. It is now holy. They say, what? Holy. They don't see the holy as real, as actually being able to manifest the world. To them, everything is just maybe logic, maybe science. Today there's a big movement. Science is real. Well, holiness is real. Holiness is real. Holiness is real. Prove it. They combat this idea, this notion of holiness. Who did this very, very, who did this in a very strong manner? The Greeks. The Greeks, when they came into the Second Temple during the story of Hanukkah, they profaned the temple. They profaned the temple. It wasn't just that they tried to destroy the temple. They actually didn't try to destroy the temple. Their goal wasn't to subjugate the Jewish people, to destroy their temple. What was their goal? Their goal was to profane. They didn't like the fact that the Jews, those Jews who were refusing to Hellenize, to embrace Greek culture, who had this idea of holiness. They said, well, we're Jewish, and there's a holy day, it's called Shabbat, and there's a holy service, there's a pure oil, and we cannot use oil which is impure. Or there is a holiness that the Jews have in the Jewish home. And the Greeks were so upset about that. There was a fence in the temple of the courtyard, and it said, only Jews beyond this point. And that was so offensive to them that the Jews felt that there was some holy space that was only reserved for them, that they actually made it a point of breaking down this fence in 13 places. Not because they needed to get through, simply because they were making a point. Similarly, when they came into the temple and they saw the oil for the menorah, and they knew that the oil had to be sealed, and they made it like it was almost like an attack on the jugs of oil themselves. They said, "Well, what if we unseal it? Right? What are you going to do now?" This idea of, well, it's still good oil. You can still light your menorah. You can still light a wick with it. What's the problem? It still lights a candle. What's the problem with it? Well, the problem is that there's holiness. And holiness needs the seal intact. Holiness, it's when you break those seals, you defile it. They couldn't stand this idea. So somebody who kind of takes this approach and says, no, he says, well, holiness, they say I don't know what holiness is, like Pharaoh, and Moshe comes to Pharaoh and he says, so says God, let my, B'ni B'chari Yisrael, my firstborn, the Jewish people, my son, my firstborn Israel. So what does Pharaoh say? He says, Lo yadaiti es Hashem, I don't know God, I know nothing about God, What do I know? He talks to him, he says, I know about death and taxes, that's what I know. I don't know about holiness. Well, so somebody who profanes the holy, they don't believe they don't see the holiness as real. And similarly, they profane the holy days. They say it's not a holy day, it's a vacation. What's the difference of holy day and vacation? Holy day is a day imbued with holiness. What is vacation? Vacation is to vacate, right? It's a day which lacks content. So the person says, "What holy days? It's a day off. It's a day off. It's a day to go to the beach, right?" Similarly, such a person will also come to not seeing the divine image in a fellow, and therefore they profane and they look down on other people. They look at other people as irrelevant. That same person is going to abrogate the covenant of the circumcision, because they say, what, the circumcision, God doesn't want to, he really wants there's something special about about the foreskin in the male organ. He says that can't be really holy, it's got to be something else. They did it because of whatever it was to control the masses, or it was population control, or it was for who knows what. They give all these. But and such a person eventually takes the Torah himself and he profanes the Torah. He doesn't see the strength and the tradition and the beauty and the importance and the Torah's way itself. He just looks at the Torah and he says, it's just a literary work, right? And he ends up just giving out all sorts of explanations that don't fit. He denies the holiness that exists in Torah, the godliness that exists in Torah. Such a person, even though that such a person has Torah study, they study a lot of Torah and they do a lot of good deeds, but their Torah is devoid of holiness. Their good deeds are just social action. It's devoid of a service of God. They have no share in Olam Haba. They have no connection to the world to come. They have no connection to that space of the beyond, of the holy, of the great. They're just confined to a very simple, very, very a life that's they just believe in the here and now. That's what what is an apikoros? An apikoros is the Talmud term for somebody who kind of denies the God's the core principles of our belief in the divine and in Torah. But Epicurus, his big idea was that all you have is the today, all you have is the here and now. Live and eat and drink today, because for tomorrow we shall die. That was their big idea. There is no. Well, such a person denies. They deny and they disconnect themselves from any greater connection, from any sense of Olam Haba, of a world to come. So again, Rabbi Elazar Hamudai is telling us about holiness. Very interesting that he's telling us this idea, because this Rabbi Elazar, as I said, was an uncle of Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba, 52 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, he leads a revolt against the Romans, and he's very, very successful. He's so successful, and his revolt is going so well that Rabbi Akiva actually believes that he is the Mashiach, that he's going to be able to drive the Romans out and rebuild the temple and gather Jewish people and reestablish the Davidic dynasty. And it looks like it's all going to happen. It looks like it's all going to happen until when? Till when? Until the Bar Kokhba, it gets to his own head. And he loses that sense of the holiness. He loses the sense of the connection to the divine. And he starts to believe that it's all about him, and it's all about military tactics, and it's all about that which is, far, which is just, I should say, just in the here and now. It's just an ability to have a good military and great tactics, and he loses that connection. And because of that, Rabbi Elazar Mudai actually starts to, he's not doing so well, and different things happen, and he suspects his uncle. I'm sorry, Bar Kokhba doesn't do. He suspects his uncle Rabbi Elazar Mudai of collaborating with the Romans, and his uncle gets killed. He has his uncle killed. Some say it was intentional or not, but anyhow, his uncle is killed for the suspected collaboration with the Romans. And why does this happen? And that turns into a travesty and a tragedy, a great tragedy, where where many Jewish people are killed and lose in the war to Rome, and it all developed because Bar Kokhba, lost his sense, he lost his connection with that which is really truly holy, that which is truly meaningful, that which is truly beyond, and he started to just believe that it's just in his ability, his strength, his physical strength, his vigor, his military tactics, and so on and so forth. All right, Mishnah 12. Myra, you want to read 12?
Sure. Rabbi Ishmael would say, be yielding to a leader, affable to the black-haired, and receive every man with joy.
Yeah. Rabbi Shmuel, so he talks about how to be a member, what is a healthy member of society? What is a healthy member of society? Have a kal larosh, be yielding to the leader. In other words, don't make it too difficult for the leaders to lead. It's so easy to get in the leader's way and to, be a complainer and be just always kind of, grabbling and under their breath, getting, anyhow, be affable. Allow the leader to lead. That's what the leader is called upon. And he says, be affable to the black-haired. The black-haired is those who are young, even somebody who is young. You don't have to be yielding to them, because on the contrary, you should use your wisdom, use your knowledge, but be affable. Be affable. Don't make it hard. Receive every man, every person one sees. Receive them, smile at them, receive them with joy. Receive them with joy. The power of a joyful, good morning, or of a joyful how are you, or of a me. It can have a tremendous effect. And we all know there's so many stories of the effect of a joyful how are you. It's a beautiful story. My uncle, my son, his name is Yossi, and Yosef Yitzchak, and he's named because he died in. I'm sorry, because he was born in the week of the Shiva of my uncle who passed away, and my uncle was he was a very pleasant person, and he used to see people and we'd welcome them and really carry out what it says here in this Mishnah about being about receiving everybody with joy. So during his shiva, one of the cleaning people from came by and said she was just talking about how every time she would see him, he would always say, "How are you?" And that lifted him up. It gave him it gave her such joy to be able to hear that, how are you? And that's really made a difference. And just so many stories. So the ability to really lift somebody up. All right. Now we are up to Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva. He is going to teach us a number of teachings in the following Mishnayot. And the first one is Mishnah 13. Basha, you want to read 13?
Sure. Rabbi Akiva would say, jesting and frivolity accustom a person to promiscuity. Tradition is a safety fence for Torah. Tithing a safety fence to wealth. Vows a safety fence for abstinence. A safety fence for wisdom is silence.
Yeah, very strong mission. This is a famous Rabbi Akiva, who only begins his course of Torah study at the age of 40. And Rabbi Akiva says as follows: Sichok v'kalus rosh, margila masadin la'erva. Jesting and frivolity accustom the person to promiscuity. The person has to be careful, like we said, to just not take life seriously. It's easy to make jokes and take our take, just take our life unseriously. He says, "Chok v'kalas rosh, magilin esadam la'erba." That type of approach, that type of approach, that frivolousness, can bring a person to promiscuity. Now he says as follows: Mesiras siyag laTorah. Tradition is a safety fence around the Torah. In other words, what is tradition? What is tradition? Tradition is the idea that we have to learn Torah, we have to study Torah with a teacher. We have to study Torah as it's taught. Torah isn't just something that we can just, it's just a book. Well, just pick it up and study it. You won't get the authentic Torah experience because there's a way that it's studied. That's why the sages, in the Talmud tells the story that the sages actually, they mourned the first time that the Torah was, they were forced, the sages were forced to translate the Torah into Greek. The king, his name was Talmai. And Talmai, or Talmi, or Ptolemy, he took 72 sages and he locked them up, each one in their own room, in their own cell. And he said, I want you to write a translation of the Torah. He wanted to have the Torah, wanted to see what does the Torah say. And he didn't want the sages to be able to collaborate because he wanted to ensure that they were not just collaborating and giving him some, fictitious translation. So he locked them up in a room and he had them translate, and he had them translate the Torah for him. And God performed a miracle, and they all translated the Torah exactly in the same way, even though, they made some slight variation. Any translation is very, very difficult to make because what is the precise translation, and there was some slight variations that had to be made for it to be properly understood. They were successful, and God gave them this gift, and this that they all had the same intuition, the same understanding, and they all wrote the Torah the same way. Yet, when they did that, the sages cried, and the sages mourned, and the sages actually proclaimed it a fast day. Why? Because the Torah isn't meant to just be a book. It's not, if once you have a translation and it goes out and it's in the world and it just makes its way around and people start reading it and they don't, and there isn't context. They don't have the tradition. It's not taught to them in the way that it's supposed to be taught. It's not in the how there's a way that we have to study Torah. There's the meaning. What does it mean? What does it mean, right? Classic example, as it says in the Torah, ayin tachas ayin, an eye in the place of an eye. And we know that the Rambam writes and others that never did the Jewish people understood that it means that you take out somebody's eye, because they took out an eye. Ayin tachas ayin means we do a replacement the best we can. We do a replacement for an eye in the place of an eye. A replacement for an eye doesn't mean to make somebody else's eye, gouge out someone else's eye. Replacement for an eye, the best replacement we could do is we can at least accommodate them financially to the point that we can make up for their eye. But then the Torah was translated and people just read it and they said, well, look what it says here, an eye for an eye. Never said punch out an eye for an eye. Never meant that. Never was studied that way. That's called Messiah. Messiah is the tradition, the way that the Torah is taught. So Rabbi Akiva is telling us Messiah's Siagla Torah. Tradition, to have a teacher, to learn from somebody who learned from somebody, is a safety fence to the Torah. That protects the Torah. That protects the Torah. You have to have a teacher to be able to properly learn Torah. Now, Maestras, Siyag Lo Isha. The Maestras, tithes, are a siyag, are a protection for our wealth. Very famous. Tithing is a safety fence to wealth. The idea is that we can look at our tithes and we could say, oh, we're giving away. We're giving away. The truth is that when we tithe, when we give our tzedakah, we're not giving away, we're protecting. We're protecting our wealth. Hashem gives us the wealth to be able to give tzedakah. And when we give that tzedakah, Hashem gives us the opportunity and to enjoy, it's not that we are giving Hashem 10%. Hashem is giving us the 90%. Hashem is giving, if we give the 10%, we get to keep the 90%. Right? In other words, if we don't give if we don't give a tithe, if we don't give the 10%, so then the whole plan is at risk. Hashem gave us what we have in order that we should be able to give tzedakah, in order that we should give the 10%. Hashem says, you give 10%, I'll give you 9 times as much. You'll have 90% for yourself. So maisris, so the tithing, siyag la'isher, that's a safety fence. So you want to protect your wealth, give tzedakah. You want to protect your wealth, give tzedakah. There's another aspect of it. You know what it is? What you give is what you have. You know, there's a famous story. There's a very wealthy man. And one day, he's asked, well, how much do you have? And he thinks for a moment and he gives out a figure which seems kind of, far less than what he has. And they say, and they turn to him and they say, well, that doesn't seems to, that seems far less than what you have. He says, you didn't ask me, how much I manage. You asked me how much I have. He says, I only have what I give away. What I manage or what's under what I'm holding, well, that could be here today. It could be gone tomorrow. It could be literally, how many stories of our Jewish history do we know? People who built up great fortunes and one day it was just all taken away from them. My grandparents, my mother, on my mother's side, my grandfather was a very, very wealthy man, and it was just all, it was all taken away, and the last few diamonds that my great grandmother was holding, she had to give to a Polish farmer to hide her in a barn. That's this is what happened from a woman who was great woman of great stature and everything else, and she's literally like just her giving away her last bits to protect her family as they're hidden in a barn. But that's not what we have. What we have is what we give. The difference that we make, that's what we have. That's what comes with us. I told the story a lot of times of Jordan Schnitzer told me that his father Harold, he told him, Harold said to Jordan, he says, you've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul. Can't take it with you. You only have what you have. What you give is what you have. Nidarim siyagla precious. Vows are a safety fence for abstinence. In other words, this is a Jewish concept, is you have to resolve. As a matter of fact, in the time, Talmudic times, people used to make vows to curb one's indulgence, to curb one's indulgence early. In other words, not just to drink and be merry, and then at the last moment, expect that everything will turn out as possible. But people make vows. In other words, understand that living a life that we have to curb some of those passions and desires early on, so that we don't lead a life that's just frivolous and like we said, promiscuous. And finally, he says, Siyag la'chachma shtika, safety fence for wisdom is silence. Because when we talk, we're just hearing our opinion. And the real safety fence, and the protection for our wisdom is silence, is the ability and the necessity to listen and to learn. You want to be wise, allow oneself to be silent.
There's a good, I was going to say, there's a good kind of saying about that it's better to remain silent and have people think you may be dumb than to open your mouth and speak and take away all doubt.
Right. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah. Okay. Who Haya Omer, Rabbi Akiva used to say, beautiful Mishnah. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem. Beloved is man, for he was created in the image of God. Every person is created in Hashem's image. How beloved is each one of us. Chiba Yisera Noidas Leishnivra B'Tselem. It is a sign of even greater love that Hashem let us know that we are created in God's image. He could have just created us out of his love and in love. We could have been created in God's image, but Hashem told us. He let us know how dear we are. Shanamar, as it says, Ki b'tzelem Elohim asata Adam, for in the image of God he made man. Okay. Beautiful gift of being created in Hashem's image, the love of being created in Hashem's image. And the even greater love that Hashem lets us know that we are each created in the divine image. Chavivin Yisrael, beloved are the Jewish people, shenikru banim lamakom, because we are called, banim are called children of the omnipresent one. Chiba Yisera, and an even greater love, no daslam, because it has been made known to us, shenikru banim lamakom, that we are called Hashem's children. Hashem let us know that we are. It's not just that Hashem considers us as children, but Hashem shared this great love with us. Shanamar, as it says, Banim atem laHashem Elokeichem, you are children to Hashem your God. Okay. Chaviv in Yisrael, how dear are the Jewish people? Shenita lahem klei chemda, that God gave us a very precious article. He gave us the Torah. Chiba Yisera, no das lam shenit lam klei chemda. And even greater love is that Hashem let us know how precious we are and how precious this Torah is. Shenamar, as it says, Ki lekach tov, in Proverbs it says, Ki lekach tov nasati lechem, for I have given you a precious teaching, a good purchase. Torasi, it is my Torah. Al ta'azovu, don't forsake it. Hashem has incredible love for us. And he lets us know he created us in his image. He refers to us as his children. He gave us his precious gift, the Torah. He shared that with us. How profound. How much love does Hashem have for us? Very profound Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva continues and he says in Mishnah 15, he says, one of the great paradoxes of life, Hakol Tzafoi, all is foreseen. In other words, Hashem knows everything that is going to happen. And yet, at the same time, Varashus Nesuna, at the same time, free choice is given. Even though Hashem knows the outcomes, even though Hashem knows what we're going to do with our choices, but Hashem gives us the opportunity to make our own choices. So Hashem is, it's almost kind of following or in flow with the previous Mishnah. Hashem told us that we have there's so many gifts that Hashem has given to us. And even though Hashem knows, and Hashem knows absolutely what's going to happen, He gives us the freedom to make our own choices. And Hashem judges the world with goodness. But in accordance with the amount of positive deeds a person does. In other words, the bottom line is that our future and our our the way that we will be judged and our reckoning is all in our own. Is all based on our own decisions and our own impacts. And he concludes and he says, Huaya Omer, Rabbi Akiva used to say, Hakol Nasun Be'eravon. Everything is given on a pledge. In other words, everything is given to us. Hashem gives us everything. He extends credit to each one of us. Umetsuda Prusa Kalachayim, and a net is spread over the living. In other words, we're all living in the divine reality. Hachanus Psucha, the store is open. In other words, we're always taking credit from Hashem. V'achan v'nimakif, and the storekeeper God extends credit. In other words, He gives us life, He gives us wealth, He gives us health. And we're meant to translate that and to channel that Va'pinkas pesuach, and the account book lies open. In other words, we are given on credit. We're given with intent. And there's a hand that writes down all that's taken. And anybody wants could come and could borrow. The collection officers make the rounds every day. The exact payment of man with his knowledge and without his knowledge. In other words, we are held accountable for our decisions and with our decisions. And their case is well founded. And the judgment is the judgment of truth. And ultimately, all is prepared for the feast. In other words, to understand that we're living in Hashem's reality. And therefore, we should be cogent to that. We should be cognizant of that. We should take that into account. And we should remember that Hashem is extending to us the gifts of life, the gifts of good health, the gifts of the parnasah that we have. But, or I should say, and that comes with an expectation. That comes with an expectation that they're used as such, that they're given back. That the wealth that we're given is given back, is channeled appropriately, that the days that we're given, that we channel them appropriately, the opportunities that we're given, we use them appropriately. So and we're always we're always, there's always the collection is constant. Hashem is always giving us, and he's always and the accountability is constantly there. Ultimately, everything is prepared for the divine for the feast. I'm just going to go to go through the kind of to the end. We'll go a little quickly, but we're here almost at the end of this chapter, and tonight is the last class in this series. So, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Elazar, son of Azariah, would say, Imein Torah in derech eretz. If there's no Torah, there's no common decency. In other words, Torah is the foundation of a civil society. Imein derech eretz. However, if there's no civility, there's no common decency, ain't Torah. Torah can't survive there. Imein chachma ein yira. If there's no wisdom, if there's no study, there's no fear of God. Imein yira ein chachma. But as we said earlier, there has to be the fear of God to have true wisdom. Imein das ein bina. If there's no applied knowledge, there's no analytical knowledge. In other words, if we don't actually apply it, then that analyzation is meaningless. However, imein bina, but if we don't analyze ein das, there's no applied knowledge. Imein kemach ein Torah. If there's no flour, there's no Torah. In other words, under the circumstances of poverty, it's very, very hard to learn. Imein Torah ein kemach. But if there's no Torah, there's no flour. There's no point in the sense. Hu hayomer, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, kol shechachmasim rubu ma'asav u'ma'u daima. One whose wisdom is greater than his deeds. To what is he comparable to? To a tree with many branches and few roots. Comes a storm and uproots it and turns it on its face. You can have a lot of branches, but you have to have roots, and the roots are the deeds. As is stated, he shall be as a lone tree in the wasteland and shall not see when good comes. He shall dwell parched desert, the salt and land uninhabited. But ones whose deeds are greater than his wisdom, to what is he compared? To a tree with many roots and few branches. For more storms in the world cannot budge from its place. In other words, our roots are in our actual actions. As it is stated, he shall be as a tree planted upon water, whose spreads his roots by the river, who fears not when it comes heat, whose light leaf is ever lush, who worries not in a year of drought, and ceases not to yield fruit. And the final Mishnah in this chapter, Rabbi Elazar ben Chisma Omer. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Chisma, would say, the laws of the bird offering, the laws of the menstrual period, these are the meat of halacha. In other words, the intricacies of Torah. That's the real halacha. The calculations of solar seasons and gamatria, condiments of wisdom, but really getting into ultimately the wisdom is really in the halacha and the day-to-day and the way that we carry out our life. This was a wonderful explanation. We finished the entire chapter in our course together, and it's been very, very wonderful to study. Like I said, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to take a break, and we will resume, God willing, our lessons some pre-high holiday lessons. And in September, we'll talk about some of the liturgy of the high holidays and all. So thank you very, very much for joining us for this special series.
Thank you for having